Welcome everybody to session 14B, Where Will We Go? Considerations for Receiving Communities. I'm Jesse Keenan. I'm an associate professor of real estate here in New Orleans at Tulane University, and I couldn't be more thrilled to chair this session today. We have 90 minutes. We'll have 15 minutes for each of our distinguished presenters and scholars, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. Personally, I'm very interested not only what we leave behind, but where we're going. And I hope today's session, by some measure, brings that out through the work represented here today. We're going to start with Robert Stojanov at Mendel, and I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, and I apologize if I have otherwise not, at Mendel University, who will be presenting Climate Change, Plan Relocation, and Development Assistance. Please kick it off, Robert.
Hello, everybody. I'm trying to share my presentation with you. Could you see the full screen, please?
Looks good, Robert. Looks good.
Looks good. Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, so I'm happy to thank you so much for introduction. My name is Robert Stojanov. I'm from Mendel University in Brno in the Czech Republic, and I prepared the presentation all together with Alex de Chorbenin from the Columbia University and Sarah Rosengarten from Zollberg Institute from the New School. And the topic is a climate change, planet relocation, and the role of development assistance. So firstly, something about the broader context of the issue. So in the developing world, we have like a big or great potential for immigration, dealing with the underlying climate extremes, vulnerabilities, personal aspiration, economic issues, etc. And that's why a lot of people try to move from the places of origin to another places within the country, especially, but also outside the countries. That's a combination of factors. So just if you see this table, you can find like the main chapters from middle of 80s to the current estimations of how many people migrate because of any environmental issues or climate changes. So the first estimation was from the Professor El Hinawi from Egypt. Estimated about the 10 million people. And also so this is a lot of estimation, a lot of numbers, but we would like to focus what will happen with these people. So in many cases, these people cannot move because they have a lot of limits, starting with the economic limits, starting with the personal vulnerabilities because of any also environmental vulnerabilities. So these people are trapped, according to many literature, starting in 2011 with Foresight report. And the real future humanitarian crisis may get to the point that most vulnerable people cannot move. They have to stay in the places of origin. However, they would like to move, but there is not possible. During last year, we analyzed 74 reports from development agencies or multilateral banks, non-profit development organizations, and also other development institutions, which were published between 2009 and 2019, trying to find, trying to identify the main approach is how is addressing vulnerable rural population in case of their moving, and how the development agencies are play how important the role play the development agencies, they like actors, like active actors of these processes, plus also how the programs are development programs are effective. So the first approach is like an in situ adaptation. So the focus of this approach is to is place-based and seeks to make local economies and productive systems more resilient to climate change impacts. Yeah, trying to like reduce the vulnerability and enhance the adaptive capacity of the local population. The second approach is a facilitated migration for adaptation. So migration, according to this approach, can contribute to the process of climate change adaptation, and also they can also increase the resilience of migrants ascending communities, because it's very frequently associated with the rising levels of education, more stable income in if they compare with the places of origin, and also yields benefits. Yeah. So the people are also connected with some transfer, knowledge transfer, remittances, incomes, trades, investments to the communities, etc. Yeah. And the last approach, which were defined, is a planned relocation and resettlement. So we found that planned relocation can be like both a form of disaster risk reduction plus also the form of climate change adaptation. Yeah. And the planned relocation can be undertaken like a preemptively, yeah, or remediately. Yeah. So it depends if it will happen before a disaster strikes or after that, yeah, or following a disaster. Yeah. We also found that the main places of where the people are coming are the urban areas, which is nothing new, of course, but we found that not so much development programs are focusing on the cities and or the like a building a new infrastructure for the new incomers. Yeah. At the same time, migrants from the rural areas also they need a protection and also training for the new skills, uh, dealing with the new demands for living in the urban areas. And the cities need the support for like a new resilience building and adaptation priorities, which relate, as I mentioned, with building a new infrastructure, housing, transport, waste management, healthcare issues, etc. Yeah. And that's also interesting that at the same time, the demographic trends, food security concerns, and also green economy plans in a development rich countries also will likely go hand in hand with the continuing need for foreign labor. Yeah. So this trend is coming all together, and we believe that creation of like available financial products and also market instruments can help to increase resilience of the migrants diasporas. Now I would like to show you very shortly two case studies dealing with the second and third approach, which I already presented. So first one is focusing on Bangladesh. So according to this World Bank report, to the end of to the middle of the century, we can expect about 15 million people which will be affected by the floods or sea level rise. In case there will be increase about 1 meter, it will be 1.5 meter. We can expect 18 million people will be affected. This is the picture what's happening more than 10 years ago in Bangladesh when Hurricane severe affected the country. And you see that the people were not prepared, in fact. So they started to leave after the disaster when the houses were completely destroyed in a tent, and started to build a new houses. But if you can see also from the pictures, this is a so-called a new food for another hurricane or another cyclone storm. So it means I'm happy that a few years, 2 years ago, when I visited Bangladesh, the same part of the country, southwest part of the Delta. So I found that these new facilities were built like a more resilient. I found a more elevated houses, like see on this picture, using solar panels, and also the roofs were used like for water which are coming to these tanks. And when I was speaking with especially with the women there, so they were lucky they have a more time for their own business, or they have more time for like a yourself. So, and I found that this is the example how the migration from the most affected area to the more secure area completed with a new facilitated houses, new infrastructure, and another facilitated issues here. So that's I think this is a direction which can show how can we use that for let's say investment within the development program. The second case studies deals with Maldives planet relocation. Maldives is a country which probably will be affected to the end of the century, that will be flooded from the 80%. The highest point here, like a local Mount Everest, is about 2.5 meters high. So it means that sea level rise will flood it almost whole country, yeah, where the 90% of the population is living. So what's happened here for the last 10 years, what I had opportunity to see there, is that the government started to build a new artificial island. So you can see this is like a new sandy string from a coral reefs, and they started to build a new part of the islands, already existing islands, and new elevated houses here where the people can live. So from this map, you can recognize the new part. This is the capital Male on the island with the same name Male, where about 20 or 25% of the island is a new artificial part here. And this is the whole Male. This is like a almost new artificial island where is on the south is an airport. Here is the residential area, and this is a new residential area which will be built and new houses for locals. So this is planet relocation is like a new another opportunity how people can be more resilient against the sea level rise, like climate change impact. So since urban areas are potentially a destination facilitating migration to the well-planned urban sites, may be part of the suite of solution. Yeah, so we maybe try to change our mind that climate migration could be a part of the regional integration strategy. So stop the fighting against the climate migration, taking climate migration like a part of our reality, of our future, and think how can we live with that, how the people can improve the quality of their life. So I think this is the concern of the part of global North countries, because this is the like the space for the development agencies and for the new program, which are financed from the global North countries. Yeah. And also development actors have a full like a gamut of tools to intervene along the migrant life cycle and continue from disaster prevention to response and recovery. Yeah. So world is likely to experience both increased like internal and international migration flows, owing to multi-factor drivers like climate change, extreme, etc. And governmental aid agencies need to adopt a number of program and policy approaches which are connected with this climate, migration, and building a new facilitation in the cities. Yeah, thank you so much for your attention. I hope that I'm on time.
Great, thank you so much, Robert and Professor Stojanov for your work. Great array of examples and case studies to launch us into our next presenter, Dean Alice Kaswan. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who joins us from the University of San Francisco School of Law, presenting Creating Home, Multi-Level Governance Structures for Emerging Climate Migration. Please take it away.
Great, thank you so much. Let me just share my screen. All right, thank you. Does that show for everyone? Presumably so.
Yes,
all right. Okay, great. So on the left here, you see a homeless Dust Bowl migrant, and on the right, a homeless survivor from the Paradise wildfire. And to be a touch melodramatic here, I think they're asking us, ultimately, where will we go? So I'm going to be focusing here on US migration, internal migration at this point. And just to give an overview, I'll start off talking a little bit about climate drivers and destinations. My focus will be on unmanaged retreat, not managed retreat. So I'm going to be focusing on those who would be migrating on their own, whether in response to some sort of extreme disaster or a more slow onset event. So I'm going to be talking then about recognizing the many implications for the migrants and for receiving communities. My focus is going to be on housing primarily, having to choose something. And then I'll be turning to look at multi-level governance. And here again, focusing, at least for the moment, on housing, multi-level governance for better achieving affordable housing in receiving communities. So I don't think I need to tell this crowd a lot about climate change drivers, but I do want to at least ground us in the reality of climate change impacts. So I'm going to use just a few examples. So sea level rise, we have here a picture of Miami Beach. The sky is blue, it's not a hurricane. This is some of the flooding they're seeing already at this point. In terms of destinations, this is turning to Professor Keenan's work. So we have some evidence already of increased demand for property on higher ground, including in this community, which I'll talk about soon. So it's thinking about the driver and where people are going. Heat, right? It's sizzling in Phoenix, 120 degrees on occasion, and already we're seeing people fleeing to Flagstaff. Maybe for now it's to weekends, for weekends or seasonal, but will it ultimately be for longer? And you're already seeing concerns there where there's a build the wall slogan in Flagstaff, given the fear of people coming in. Water supply, drought. Here we've got a map of the United States from the National Climate Assessment showing areas where we're expecting to have water shortages, whether from drought or groundwater overdraft, or also saltwater intrusion, other various reasons why we'll be low water supplies. As we know already internationally, this is a huge issue, and Africa, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere may also be an important factor in Central American migration to the United States. But it's a problem domestically as well. And here we can remember the Dust Bowl again, migrants in camps, opposition from receiving areas like California. Wildfire, we'll have, I think, Isaac talking more about this later, but in the US Western states, Arizona recently, California, of course, Colorado, and here in Chico, right? In California, we see over 2 years since the fire, people still living in homeless camps in Chico, California. And one that we don't hear a lot of talk about, but I think is worth further exploration, is whether our decarbonization strategies themselves could end up prompting some amount of migration as we end fossil fuel dependence. Of course, our poster child is coal here, but if we decarbonize, move away from fossil fuels, then we could be talking about a lot of impacts in the oil and gas sector. I know when President Biden reported on his moratorium on new oil and gas leases, Louisiana television reported that 200,000 oil and gas jobs were at risk in Louisiana. Now, whether that was true or not is less the story than, you know, if we look forward over the next decade or two to decarbonization, will we find new economic development in place, or will people move? All right, so I want to start talking about migration's implications, looking first at potential benefits. It's not all gloom and doom. It could offer benefits if channeled to the right places. So we have, as we know, a number of Rust Belt communities in the United States that are in the upper Midwest. They've lost population with the loss of manufacturing and potentially have room to grow. And these may also be areas that will have at least less challenging climate impacts. Professor Keenan himself has done some work, as we know, with Duluth, Minnesota, potentially consider it a climate haven in that context. It was built for more people than it currently has. There are other cities that you hear talk of often, Buffalo, touting itself as a potential climate refuge, even Cincinnati, Ohio. Now, of course, I don't want to imply that migration success is just about using unused infrastructure or filling empty buildings. There's still a lot of issues, even in these areas. Employment, people left because there weren't employment opportunities, so that may still be a concern. Services, cultural issues, people's fear of new migrants coming in who are different, especially if they're a different race, or even in some cases age, which may be some of the issue in Chico, cultural differences. But at least unused infrastructure, it at least provides a platform for realizing in-migration benefits and may present at least somewhat fewer issues than we encounter in other areas. Well, that's the happy talk. Now I'm going to turn to some of the challenges for migrants, especially difficult for people with special needs, the elderly, the disabled, and others. My focus will be primarily on low income, because I think they will face the greatest challenges, again, along all features of daily life. But because I can't do everything, I will be focusing primarily for this talk on housing. Well, when we look at the nation as a whole, we already have a shortage of affordable housing. Now, there's some areas that have enough housing, but there are many more situations where housing shortages, where we have housing shortages than situations where we have excess housing. And migrants, whether they're following family ties or perceived employment or just hoping for the best, may end up in areas that don't have enough affordable housing. So looking at it nationally, we currently only have 10 million rental units for 18 million very low income renters. That means they are paying a lot more than they can afford. This chart shows that 80% of very low income renters are cost burden. And over 60% of them, looking at the dark line here, are paying over 50% of their income on housing. The story is not much better when we look at people who want to have homes, want to own rather than rent. Demand for homes exceeds supply by 1.6 million. That's why homes are expensive. And the gap here is all in low and middle income homes. And that gap is increasing each year. We see rising homelessness, right, with the lack of affordable housing, both renting and ownership. We're also likely to see racial disparities in access to housing. This chart just shows how the long history of racial discrimination has led to persistent segregation. We're seeing as much or more segregation now than we've seen historically. And that pattern of segregation is likely to be correlated with greater difficulties for people of color to find housing than for their white counterpoints. All right, so our migrants may go to areas that are already lacking adequate affordable housing, worsening the deficit there. Here in Orlando, Florida, right, where many Hurricane Maria refugees landed. Again, many went to Orlando due to family ties and other things, but they confronted an already existing severe shortage of affordable housing in the area. Tens of thousands have stayed, and they're still confronting a lack of affordable housing. Similarly, for the Camp Fire, which destroyed the town of Paradise, nearby Chico had an influx of 20,000 people in a town that has only 100,000 residents, insufficient housing for them, and many are homeless. Around 25% of the homeless that currently are there as of May 2021 are low-income fire survivors. Here's a camp of one of them. In the receiving communities themselves, we're going to see impacts on housing prices. And of course, that'll affect not only the migrants, but the people, the existing residents who live in these receiving communities. And whether it's wealthy or poor people arriving, it will impact housing prices. So for people who are already poor and cost burdened in these communities, they're going to see higher prices and have to either spend an increasing share of their income on housing or be displaced to new areas or into homelessness. And even if wealthier residents are the ones who come in rather than poor migrants, if we have trapped populations who can't move and it's the wealthy who move, even if they're not directly competing for the same housing, they could increase property values and again lead to displacement of existing residents to gentrification. And as we know, this is a cite from Professor Keenan's work. We're seeing some evidence of that in Miami already within the city. So I suggest that we do need a multi-level governance response. Existing governance mechanisms aren't sufficient to address these challenges. So long term, we're going to need a national strategy, and we can't just let it happen willy-nilly, and we can't leave it just to the receiving communities themselves to cope. It's not fair. It's not their fault that they're the receiving communities, and they're assuming ultimately a national burden on our behalf. And we also have the risk that they won't deal with it, that they could end up adopting or maintaining exclusive policies for a wide range of reasons. Could be a fear of immigrants, whether they're domestic or international, a fear of change, social, economic disruption. And they often have zoning that that is driven by those concerns, as well as fiscal zoning, right? The desire to maintain their tax base. In Chico, for example, they know they don't have enough affordable housing, but they're building housing for the wealthy Bay Area immigrants looking to telecommute. They're not building affordable housing to deal with the shortages and homelessness problem. So I don't think any single level of government can address this problem. It can't just be federal or local. We need to have a system that's going to work for everyone. So what are the components for multi-level governance? One is that we need national level research and tracking of migration trends and projections that'll help us do matchmaking, right? Let's match the migrants with the communities that have the infrastructure that would most benefit. And let us also just figure out where people are likely to want to go, even if it's not perfectly aligned, so that we can start to help those locations prepare. Beyond that, I think we're going to need to require receiving community planning, potentially on a regional level. And I think we could look to further some of the regulations under the Fair Housing Act that were promulgated by the Obama administration, though rescinded by the Trump administration, called the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Regulations. And these were designed to encourage fair housing, in part to address historic racial discrimination. So here we would need substantive federal parameters and oversight to make sure that local governments are taking migrant needs into account. So we need a federal role because local governments are not likely to necessarily take the needs of those who are not in their communities into account. At the same time, we need to have a very strong local role. We need local assessments and planning that are grounded in current and future needs. Locally, local governments are closer to the people and they know local conditions. In terms of participation, we also need the federal government to be establishing some parameters along with the substantive parameters. We need mechanisms to ensure local engagement and especially meaningful participation by groups that have been historically marginalized, whether that's low income, the BIPOC communities, the elderly, and others. I'm sorry if you can hear the trash being collected outside my window. Be done soon. I also think we need to look at land use requirements. In receiving communities that are likely to receive an influx or who are capable of receiving an influx, we may need to do something very controversial and address things like zoning, right? Local zoning, local governments have often had zoning that blocks affordable housing. A lot of discussion about that these days in terms of exclusive zoning policies. So we need to have, at least in those areas where the zoning is precluding affordable housing, we may need a federal push. We may need to have federal oversight that makes sure that local governments are revising zoning as needed to provide more inclusionary rather than exclusionary zoning. In this process, we may also need to make sure that areas that risk gentrification are taking mechanisms to address it. Again, those mechanisms may vary by region. And in some cases, we may need to see affirmative steps to further the development of affordable housing, that the government is going to be taking efforts to subsidize, to work with developers on mechanisms that will further the development of affordable housing, even potentially additional public housing in this context. Now, all of this will take money. I don't think the federal government can end up playing a role or requiring local governments to play an important role without providing significant federal resources. Again, I think it's necessary to make this investment and it's fair in this context. Ultimately, this proposal, if that's what it is, needs to find the right policy home. I'm not sure this would be standalone legislation, if that's what we were to look to. And I think there's a lot of question about what the right policy home is, whether it's one or all of these. Should it be part of climate adaptation policy, including disaster recovery? Should it be a part of housing policy? Should it be a part of poverty and social justice policy? Should it be, in some ways, all of the above? It does sit at the intersection of all of these important areas. So I want to thank you. I'll note that I have a lot more detail in a paper that should be out this month or next in the Temple Law Review as part of a symposium they had on migration. And I'll look forward to our next speaker.
Thank you so much, Alice, for the extremely provocative ideas pushing us forward here domestically. I'm all for federal preemption over local land use, among many others. I'm very excited to welcome Professor Karim Ahmed from the New School, professor, among other things, of architecture, which brings us to a material realm and a realm of geography and place, which is critical to our understanding of people, place, property, and the like. So Professor Ahmed, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Professor Keenan. Good afternoon. As Jess was saying, my name is Karim Ahmed. I'm an architect based in the Bronx. I teach at the New School in New York City. Before I begin, I'd like to give a credit and a big thank you to the New School Urban Systems Lab for granting me the faculty fellowship to do this research. So this research was spurred in particular by two impetuses. The first was the movement at the federal level towards developing the Green New Deal and other large infrastructure proposals. And these are proposals, scales of which have not been seen since the Federal Aid Highway Act and the Works Progress Administration. The results of such policies would be transformational, so it's all the more important that they cement holistic planning in them. The second was the increasing severity of wildfire, drought, and heat wave in the Western United States. concluding in 2019 insurers' reluctance to provide insurance on properties they deemed to be too likely to be affected by fire. The fact that the insurance industry deemed something untouchable was definitely a flag that the conversation about natural hazards, especially hazards beyond flooding, would be coming to the forefront in the coming years. The existing research is framed as an opening a broader discussion that is typical of the current discourse around managed retreat. The existing literature on managed retreat is generally particular in two regards. Deals primarily with one type of natural disaster, most often flooding, or the research deals primarily with a specific geographic area or population, such as an indigenous group. However, in the last few years, other types of natural disasters have come to the forefront of national attention. The questions I'm asking here are to test correlations between an all hazards approach and the current flooding criteria used in managed retreat programs at the federal level across the United States. And I looked at hazards and risks at a county level, particularly in populated areas. The main sources I used for this were the National Risk Index published by FEMA in October of 2020, located in the top left-hand corner. The National Risk Index was a measure of three different scales. The first was the natural hazards and summation of natural events in terms of their severity, estimated annual loss, historic loss ratio, loss including human life. Combine that with a measure of social vulnerability, which was a matter of race, class, ethnicity, wealth, employment, and other personal measures. And then it also factored in a community resilience, which was used the BRIC. And there, what they used to create the index was effectively saying, if we have all of these hazards, and then people are already at these, social vulnerabilities, for lack of a better term, a handicap, and but that maybe people could have some resilience through their community. Let's create an index and measure that out. The other mappings that I used were the core-based statistical areas in the United States, which is a measure of the metropolitan and micropolitan counties, and I took a look at the USDA cropland measures of cropland usage. So to get to that first set of questions, do counties that currently face high flooding hazards also compare as high hazard when accounting for other severe natural hazards? And the initial findings suggest there's definitely a strong correlation between counties that have high flooding hazards and high hazards in general, particularly among metropolitan and micropolitan populated areas. This correlation makes sense because the same water features that could provide flooding hazards to settlements could have also and may continue to provide strong reasons for early settlement in the first place. The bodies of water allow marine transportation, fishing, and other extractive industries. Fresh water can obviously be used for irrigation and possibly potable water. There may also be correlations to other hazards by nature of dense settlement. For instance, the thermal mass of a city in conjunction with smog could create a heat island effect that exacerbates qualities of a heat wave to create conditions that increase loss of life. The weaker correlation between hazardous, sparsely populated areas and flooding hazards seems intuitive as well. Putting flooding hazards aside, putting other hazards aside, historically, earlier settlements, less water would have supported less life. And the odds that these would grow to be micropolitan or metropolitan areas today would be less likely. Sort of the second question, looking at kind of other trends that I was kind of discovering. I discovered too many for a short presentation, but I would like to draw attention to a few in particular. The first was that because political boundaries aren't drawn along the lines of natural hazards, different counties and even different states might be subject to the same hazardous event, and each of the municipalities within that state could have dramatically different political and socioeconomic conditions within their borders. For example, close to home here, Manhattan, New York, and Hudson County, New Jersey, opposite sides of the Hudson River. So affected by something like Superstorm Sandy, the estimated loss from property damages, loss of life, vary, very extraordinarily from one side of the river to the other. This is partially because there are very local conditions, such as the Palisades on the New Jersey side of the river, which limit the damage to a certain extent compared to the low-lying areas of Eastern Manhattan going into the other boroughs. The amount of the value of the development that's in a place like Manhattan, and so we have very, very different risk values associated from the same event, really somewhere a stone's throw away. The second trend I was really interested in was how counties reached very high hazard and risk levels with hazards that correlate to each other, while other counties measured multiple hazards that were more independent of each other. So one could imagine a drought contributing to dry conditions that raise the likelihood of a wildfire spreading. So, two heat-related events. Perhaps there is a heat wave that contributed to the drought too. But in other counties, you'd find that hazards tended to occur in different seasons. So you might have a county where there was flooding in one season and heat waves in another season. You would also find that there would be hazards that the National Risk Index measured, for instance, things like earthquake that operate on a geological scale as opposed to an annual scale, or an annual time frame, I should say. And this kind of relates to the third trend, which is the seasonal or temporal nature of a hazard, and how that could inspire land use and policy around managed retreat. For instance, could a region that experiences very harsh summers, but is otherwise pleasant the rest of the year, support a university town where the majority of the inhabitants of the place, leave for that harsh season, and the people who remain could perhaps be in housing that's located in very strategic ways? Or could areas that have a variety of hazards throughout the year be ranked higher on a list for managed retreat? The last trend I found was how many counties supported highly vulnerable populations live in low to moderately hazardous conditions, and how policy can address populations that are relatively safe compared to a population that is flooded annually, but for whom even a moderately hazardous event could be deeply unstabilizing. It speaks a little bit to the last presentation we heard, but the prevalence of this, especially in the southeastern United States, was a little bit shocking to me. The National Risk Index, published by FEMA in October of 2020, opens a new slew of questions that will need to be addressed in any federal infrastructure and land use plans. Previous studies have outlined how federal managed retreat policy was inadequate for addressing even the intended causes of retreat, namely riverine and coastal flooding, let alone other pressing natural hazards such as wildfire and heat wave. Managed retreat policy in the United States has remained a largely blunt tool, but the consolidation of hazard and vulnerability data reveals clearer and more nuanced policy needs. An analysis of correlation drew attention to a few typologies of interest in particular: seasonally or temporally retreatable areas, highly socially vulnerable populations living in areas of moderate or low risk of natural hazard, and counties adjacent to each other with similar natural hazards, but substantial differences in their population's social vulnerability and community resilience. Future physical infrastructure, as well as social policy and land use planning, should be oriented to address these and other risk typologies. Thank you very much for your time. If anyone would like to contact me after the conference, look forward to continuing discussion we can't get to in Q&A.
Thank you very much, Karim. Very interesting, and it's good to see the National Risk Index finding its way into various scope of research these days. So thank you very much. We have our next guest is Isaac Gendler, who joins us from California, who will be taking on more precise orientation of what's going on in California. So take it away, Isaac.
Oh, it'll be my pleasure. Let me get my screen shared. Cool. Can y'all see it?
Yes, looking good.
Sounds good. Well, hello everyone. It's a great pleasure to meet you today. My name is Isaac Gendler. I am an independent scholar focusing on the interface between climate change adaptation and housing policy. And I'm here to present to you my work on the effects of migration during the San Francisco Bay Area housing crisis on regional wildfire hazard. So, California's been in the news a lot lately. And in the climate universe, it's really been about wildfires. They're bad and they're getting worse. And we've been talking a lot about them at this conference. And the reason why is because we know climate change is making fire-prone areas of California worse. It's making them more intense, making the fires spread into new land, and it's making the fires last for longer durations. All in all, California, to many people's eyes, is becoming more unlivable. Buildings are getting destroyed, the air is turning toxic, you name it. It's like the Hebrew Bible. And these disasters are becoming more and more particularly concentrated in the northern part of the state. Now, at the same time, California is also experiencing deep housing crisis. Prices for owning and renting property just keep on going up and up and up for the most part. It's almost impossible for even an experienced professional to purchase a house in the most high demand areas of the state. And this problem is especially acute in Northern California because of the issues that the San Francisco Bay Area is having. San Francisco Bay Area, by many measures, is the most expensive metropolitan area in the United States. And since these two problems are going on at the same time, a lot of people are starting to think that, maybe the housing crisis is exacerbating the wildfire crisis. The logic is simple. As the core part of the Bay Area becomes more and more expensive, people will be forced to move out into the wildland urban interface, or the edge between where humans habitat and where nature starts to really take over. And that's where a lot of wildfires spring up. It's only it makes sense, right? The more people we put out there, the more structures, the more likely fires are going to start and the more things are going to burn. As a resident of the San Francisco Bay Area who saw the effects that the Paradise Fire had on us during 2018, I too have become curious about this. And so to really get to the bottom of this, I decided to take a deep dive into it. And while I came out finding no statistically significant results, I do believe that the work presented here is very useful implications for future researchers, journalists, and policymakers. So let's begin the story. Like every good bit of research, we started out by constructing a methodological framework. We divided it into 4 parts. The first was our demographical data in the Bay Area census. We looked at Bay Area census tracts from 2012 and 2018. We chose 2012 as a beginning point because that was the end of the last Great Recession when housing prices in the Bay Area started going up again. And we chose 2018 as our endpoint because at the time of study, that was the most recent census data available. And we specifically looked at demographics and social vulnerability in these census tracts and how the population changed during these 2 years. We also analyzed the wildfire hazards that were present in the Bay Area. And of course, to get to the big question, in the third part, we decided to use regression to say, okay, well, we're going to take this population change, we're going to take this wildfire hazard, and we'll see if there's any correlation, there's any link between these. And from there, we're able to find our results. So as I mentioned, the first part of the study was really concentrated on demography. At the beginning of the study, we decided to map out using GIS each census tract in the 9-county San Francisco Bay Area region, that being Alameda through Sonoma counties, as you can see right here. We use census tracts as our base geographical reference point because that provided the most granular detail we can get for the data we use. It's also a very common reference point for social science researchers such as myself. So within these census tracts, we obtained demographic data from the IPUMS NHJS database for both 2012 and 2018. We decided to divide population numbers amongst the census racial groups that were used, that being Black, White, Latinx, well, Asian, and Native American. And we also looked at the population change in an area. We quantified it as percentage change for each of the census racial groups as well as the total groups. And we also constructed a social vulnerability index for each of the census tracts using each of the factors on the right. These were percentage-based values for each of the census tracts, which were equally weighed when creating a singular number. So it took in factors such as what percentage of the population is below poverty level, what percentage of the population is disabled, and what percentage of the population lives in multi-unit housing, or what percentage of the population, what percentage of the housing is multifamily housing, to be more specific. And from this, we were able to, get that change we needed, get those factors. Over here is a visualization of the census tract percentage change in population from 2012 to 2018. This is the total population, but each census group was definitely measured. And once we compiled all this demographic information, we worked on the wildfire hazard estimation. For wildfire, we used two different approaches at the same time to make sure that any data we uncovered would be rigorous and consistent. First, we used the data from the USDA wildfire potential data set. This is a collection of raster data points representing the wildfire hazard on an area. You can see this on the left picture, where each different colored dots represent a different wildfire potential value, with the more red a dot is representing a higher intensity of wildfire potential. To interface it with our census data, the wildfire hazard data was absorbed by each census tract, and the average of all of the wildfire hazard potential raster values was used for that census tract wildfire hazard value. To really, make sure that our approaches was also consistent and rigorous, we also used the wildfire building damage data and looked at every census tract that had been affected by wildfire building damage from 2013 to 2019. This is because prior building damage is a pretty good indicator of the wildfire hazard of an area. If it burns, then the area is definitely burnable. We obtained the data from the CAL Fire Damage Inspection Specialist, or DINS dataset. Each of these datasets use the same years of study for regression. From here, we're able to create a matrix for the social vulnerability and wildfire index. This is not the DNS, this is the first WHP values. Here, we're able to classify each census tract into one of four categorizations, dealing with if it was low or high social vulnerability or low or high wildfire hazard potential, and the combination between them. So moving on, we were able to use regression to get our quantitative results. Our first was the WHP data results, and we saw that total population grew in all census tract categorizations. However, white and Black populations only grew in high WHP, high social vulnerability census tracts. Native American populations grew in all except for high WHP, high social vulnerability, and Asian and Latinx populations grew in all cases due to the fact that these census groups have the highest population gains for the entire region for this time period. However, none of this showed any statistical significance. We found the R-squared values by taking the regression between fire hazard and population change. This means that we should be very careful to jump to any conclusions. Similar problems we found with the second approach. We found no real statistical difference between damaged and undamaged census tracts, whether or not they were low or high social vulnerability, or what census racial groups we looked at. So in conclusion, no direct impacts were available, that there are a lot of limitations to the study. We were unable to get any access to point-to-point migration. We have a lack of long-term historical trends, and that the social vulnerability index is not all-encompassing. We also might look at potential methodological changes in the future, such as electricity outages or fire insurance claims. And for future uses, we can use this to acknowledge the lack of data to support the higher housing crisis wildfire connection and encourage limiting development in fire-prone areas. Thank you for your time, and it's been my honor to present to you all.
Well, thank you very much, Isaac. Sometimes that is the nature of research, but I think there may be some very interesting implications there in terms of measures and degrees of constraint as it relates to new production that may be latent in some of your findings as dispersed as they may be. But I'd like to present to you our final panelist, last but not least, Dr. Julian Groth, who will be joining us from Leipzig, Germany, and the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research, who will be presenting on some really, I think, insightful work from Ethiopia. So thank you, Juliana, for joining us.
Yeah, hello. Thank you for the introduction. So I will share my screen now. I'm asking you, can you see my full screen, like presentation mode?
Yes, looks good.
Okay, great. Wait a second. Okay, now I see my laser pointer, I think so. Okay, yeah, hello everybody. I'm Julian, and I'm from the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research in Leipzig, Germany. And I'm actually a doctoral researcher, not yet a doctor, at the Mixoko Junior Research Group, where we focus on the linkages between environmental change and human migration. So this presentation will be about an empirical study I conducted during my PhD research in the southwestern parts of Ethiopia, and where I looked at the linkages between migration, livelihoods, and environmental change in a forested landscape. And actually, with this study, we wanted to broaden the scope a bit by also looking at mediating factors of the relationship between migration and the environment, and by focusing on the livelihoods of migrants, but also of locals, and the related challenges in receiving communities and for migrants. So let me continue. So our case study site for this research is a district called Gorafherda and located in a very remote corner of the country. And as you can see in the photos, it's covered by forest, and it's actually a hotspot for biodiversity, the origin of white coffee. And in this area changed a lot in the past 2 decades. And well, today I cannot go into the details for the sake of time, but I will give you now a brief overview of what changed in this area. Okay, well, first of all, this area is an immigration hotspot within the country. And starting in 2001, why this is not working? Here now. Okay. So starting in 2001, small-scale farmers from the drought-prone and degraded northern highlands of the country migrated to this region. These people were farmers and looking for fertile and available land to farm. So I call them northern migrants, and they are here in the map indicated with the green arrow. And they came, well, spontaneously on their own, so without any institutional support. So, or you can also call it, they came with unmanaged. There was a second group. In 2003, the Ethiopian government launched a large resettlement program and resettled around 8,000 farmers from the southern highlands of the country to this district, here indicated with a yellow color. And these 1,000 migrants, they received lands, like 2 hectares of land from the state, which they were allowed to use and to farm. Well, what is interesting is that in contrast, the northern migrants, they did not receive any formal state-recognized land use rights. So instead, the northern people, they started to farm and clear unclaimed lands in this area, or made arrangement with the local clans, because the locals, they had their own traditional tenure system in place. Okay, so looking at the changes between 2003 and 2018, so this is basically the period we focused on in our study. And so, well, looking at the situation in 2003, so which was like shortly after the arrival of both migrant groups, the district looked more or less like this. So the migrants here in yellow and the green huts, they focused on cropping activities as they were used to do in their places of origin in the highlands. And the locals, however, here in, with the red huts on the right side, they were like shifting cultivators and heavily dependent on the forest resources. And actually in 2003, the forest area was still quite large and dense and very close to their homesteads. So in 2018, the situation looks a bit changed. Around 2018, a lot of the forest area is gone and the cropland expanded. And regarding livelihoods, well, the migrants, they still engage in farming activities, but now also the locals engage in farming activities similar to the migrants. So within the study, we wanted now to understand how exactly livelihoods have changed, and why they have changed or transitioned, and what role plays migration together with other non-demographic factors in all of this. To answer this, we conducted household surveys in 2019 and asked about the household livelihoods in 2018 and 2003. And we surveyed all 3 population groups randomly and worked in 3 different villages. But for the data analysis, we used descriptive and analytical statistics to understand how livelihoods have changed and to identify the drivers of household engagement in forest activities for both years. And we complemented our findings with qualitative insights from focus group discussions, observations, and different interviews we conducted. Okay, I'm jumping now to the results. So the figure shows the average share of forest activities contributing to the entire livelihood of a household for all the 3 groups. On the left side, you see this for 2003, and on the right side for 2018. And what we see that in both years, as expected, locals have the highest share in forest activities, and that forest activities declined from 2003 to 2018, but mainly in the local households. We found in our data that mainly the collection of wild coffee and wild honey, which are the most important non-timber forest products, are declined in local households. So now the question is, why have the use of non-timber forest products declined in local households? Actually, during the interviews, the locals reported that it became just too difficult and too time intensive due to a shrinking forest area and an increased forest degradation to collect NTFPs. So it was too difficult to reach the places where they usually collect these. And here you see some of our model results showing the relative importance of all of our predictors for the share of forest activities in 2003. And we see that the available forest area is among the most important predictors in supporting what the locals reported. So while the locals attributed this decline in NTFP use to the expansion of small-scale agriculture and large-scale agriculture. And interestingly, in 2005, the Ethiopian government released a new land proclamation, which made it more easier for the state to transfer land to private investors. And this resulted in an additional of 22,000 hectares of land in the district, which was transferred to private investors. Another reason the locals indicated was that the more intensive farming practices and uses of herbicides will lead to forest degradation, biodiversity loss. What we also found is that in 2003, households, like northern migrant households, cleared twice as much forest as the other two groups. And well, a likely explanation is that in contrast to the southern resettled migrants, the northern, as I explained before, did not receive state-recognized land use rights. So they found themselves in a rather insecure situation and cleared more forest to consolidate their land claims. So yeah, and well, besides forest availability, it is also important how groups can access the forest. And in this area, there were quite some changes. So the access to the forest was more and more restricted by the government, and as response to a shrinking forest area. And in some villages, the forest management was also transferred to the village communities. However, we found that locals are rarely part of the village forest management groups. And as for the reasons, they reported that they cannot participate because they don't speak Amharic, which is the official language in Ethiopia and also the language used in these group meetings. But most of the locals don't speak the language. In contrast, migrants are usually fluent in Amharic. So in some, like the shrinking forest area and barriers to participate in these forest groups made it increasingly difficult for the locals to collect NTFPs and continue with their traditional livelihood activities. A last result I want to share is this. You see here the model, the relative importance of the predictors for the 2018 model, and you see that seasonal cropland is among the most important predictors. And we saw that seasonal cropland increased, which was as expected. And in local households, we find that seasonal cropping substituted forest activities. And what is interesting is the following. The locals reported that they adopted the farming practice of the migrants. So there was a knowledge diffusion or transfer regarding these livelihood activities from the migrants to the local, but there was only little exchange the other way around. So as two factors we think which explain this is that, as I said before, NTFP collection became more challenging, and also that the agriculture policies of the state government very much promoted the production of cash crops for national and international markets, actually fueling the uptake of intensive farming practices. Okay, and to wrap this up, so altogether we can say that migration of land-seeking smallholders is only one contributing factor to forest cover decline and livelihood transition in this area. The expansion of large-scale commercial agriculture in the area is at least equally important. So, and as mediators for the linkages between migration, livelihoods, and the environment, we identified that actually the access to the local resource management institutions are quite crucial. So they really have to ensure equal participation. Also, the economic strategies matter. So these agriculture policies fueled the uptake of intensive farming, and there was also fueled soil and forest degradation. So we think that promoting mixed livelihoods would be a good possible way forward for well, more sustainable and adapted to have activities which are more sustainable and adapted to the local conditions. And finally, like the land tenure security is quite crucial. So securing tenure rights for all residents, including migrants, might reduce forest clearing activities, but this has to be done without curtailing like local land rights. So in our study area, a state-led land redistribution overruled the local traditional tenure system, which led actually to heavy tensions, violent conflicts, and marginalization and migrant blaming. So yeah, maybe a possible way is to really restrict the expansion of large agribusinesses in migrant receiving areas, which already have to deal with so many competing interests in land and natural resources. And a last point is that, well, you have to include the host communities in this decision-making and on land distribution. So thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to questions. And well, we submitted a paper on the study with a lot more details. It's hopefully out at the end of the year.
All right, thank you so much. I think if you could end the screen share, okay, and if everybody could join us now. We don't have a lot of dialogue in the Q&A, so if you have the opportunity, for those of you watching and listening, now's the time to queue up to offer some insight. In fact, Juliane, you and Alice in many ways should have gone back to back, because I found so many interesting parallels. And I'll begin with you in part because there's a couple things that made me think about your findings and how they may play out in a domestic context here in the United States. I mean, I'm thinking about the extent to which people move in the United States. Let's say they migrate north, if you will, and they not only buy a house, but they become speculative investors, knowing that others are behind them, right? And in many ways, that seems to be part of the overconsumption. Part of it is land tenure security, but a part of it is also their own sort of speculative interest, it would see in footing and grounding their own economic viability and livelihood. So different contexts economically, but similar in land use. So let me ask you, Julian, building off of your presentation here, you know, is this really about synchronizing the land tenure system with these informal property rights? And is that a question of governance? And building back on Alice's contextualization or framing, you know, is there a governance mechanism here that can mediate a more local community tenure property right system with these outsiders, essentially? You know, is governance part of it, or is there something more central to environmental management?
Well, I would say that the government took already a great part in this, because they well, they distributed land to the migrants, and then they also had this land redistribution, which already led, which lead therefore that the locals lost land because they did not respect the traditional tenure system. They did not care for it, basically. So I think, well, as they kind of, I think, have to manage that people are coming to these areas and want to settle there, and they of course have to maybe provide them with land. They need to talk to the local communities about it, because it's from their perspective, it's their land, so it's their ancestors' land. Mm-hmm. So well, they have to agree on something. Right,
and they'll have to ultimately be neighbors and have some cooperative and co-locational you know, enterprise to survive and to thrive. Alice, going back to your presentation, which I felt like was very provocative on a number of different levels, and you'd raised the prospects that decarbonization itself may be a process of driving some elements of migration. And certainly there's a labor force dimension there, and you cited Louisiana and probably even Texas in terms of petroleum engineers and the income that they make relative to the distribution of income and other facets of the workforce, and the impact that that may have on so much of a more localized economy. It also is interesting to note that there's also some debate in terms of conflicting land uses about the scale of carbon capture itself. And in Louisiana, I've understood it that many of the petrochemical facilities themselves are starting to think about what carbon capture would look like and how much land it would take to existing or anticipated technologies and the conflicts that set up. But I thought what was most central to, or impactful, at least in stimulating my own thinking in your presentation, was this idea, and you didn't say it in these terms, in terms of federal preemption, but land use and the extent to which we have greater federal oversight, particularly in terms of receiving communities. And I'm curious if you could get into that a little bit further for our benefit. I think of it as a kind of a carrot and sticks, and maybe a little bit of a carrot in terms of incentivizing inclusionary zoning and the like. Currently in the state of Florida, inclusionary zoning is prohibited at a state level. So local jurisdictions really can't impose those types of allocations in terms of income and the like. But what does this look like? Is it more driven in terms of litigation, civil rights? Is this or is this something that is programmatically more of an incentive-driven type of regulation?
I don't think we'd get very far in terms of litigation or civil rights, given the record of the courts on these issues. The only potential hook might be under the Fair Housing Act, but I think that might still be probably more limited than what we want. I think I'm looking toward new federal policies, and maybe in response to the last presentation, I'll just note that sometimes you do have to be careful what you wish for. So I don't think any federal program or any governmental role is necessarily a positive one. You have to be very explicit about what it is you want to have in that federal or governmental role. So I'd be thinking more about a programmatic carrot approach. And I think in the long term, the enticement is federal resources. I think federal resources are necessary because not only because it's only fair, right, to these communities, but also I think they would provide the carrot that might induce local governments or regions to have more inclusive land use policies, particularly if they, and it may take them experiencing significant migration that they're unable to handle. So if there comes a point where they're confronting significant human suffering, even a fear of descending into chaos, whatever it may be that it would take us getting to that point before we would see a willingness to take the federal resources in exchange for more inclusive zoning, as well as a more proactive approach to really building. Now, I would like it for that to happen before we end up at that point, right? The idea is to help receiving or potential receiving communities plan and anticipate potential in migration in a way that'll allow for both a more, I could call it orderly, but also more humane process of migration. But I think if not the specter, at least the reality of significant migration over the next, again, probably decades, right? Maybe what's needed to spark the federal policies.
Yeah, it'll be interesting exactly what those incentives are and beyond project level finance, like LIHTC or tax credit programs or something like that, because it's going to have to be, whether it's, cost burden waivers or share waivers for hazard mitigation, or just community development block grant applications with greater discretionary elements that give them a little bit more freedom to make it really worth it for them.
Yeah. I am hoping, and again, I'm one of the things I'm very interested right now as a general matter is how much do we do through planning and how much do we do through project specific efforts. So I think some combination of sort of a more systemic planning that hopefully integrates that community participation with federal parameters that help guide the process would be the goal in terms of planning for future housing needs, and then creating to some degree incentives, but you may also want to be setting aside land or coming up with other more proactive measures that are actually sort of more thoughtfully and strategically directing future development.
Yeah, and this is where we come back to Juliane and land conservation as a critical role here. Karim, it's really interesting. First of all, the National Risk Index, so new. People are sort of figuring out what works, what doesn't. How does this relate to the CVI, Community Vulnerability Index, CDC? What are the touch points where we have some granularity in method and research and outcomes? There's something you noted, and there's the shock and stress of climate, and it's very often the stress that we tend to, but researchers pick one or the other. But I think one of the things that you brought up that was interesting to me was this idea of temporal retreat, or the kind of seasonal dimensions, which I think is very interesting, particularly in a short to intermediate time horizon. And that can have so many different implications just in my head, thinking about sales tax base, right? And the idea that you have flows of people at different times of year. Maybe you could get into that a little bit more in terms of your thinking of seasonality and the temporal nature of retreat.
Yeah, I think that I think I was drawn to that in particular from the architectural perspective, my background there, and how, thinking about building types that oftentimes do have like a very seasonal element. So whether it's, a beach town that's active in the summer, or a university town that's vacant in the summer, or not completely, but the other piece of it is the agricultural. And there was actually a great presentation yesterday talking about very subtle types of retreat in agriculture in particular. And that was something that really got me thinking. And I forgot her name, but I'll have to look it up. But she was saying that managed retreat could take the form in something as not as literal as totally retreating from somewhere, but from changing one type of crop to another. Mm-hmm. She would consider a form of managed retreat. So something that's growing season is maybe 10 days less, or something that could stand a little bit more heat. By chance, I don't know why I've recently started eating millet as an alternative to rice. And I looked it up. I started by looking it up. I said, why did, I've seen films where people are eating millet. Why doesn't anybody eat millet anymore? And it's a much more effective crop from a water use perspective. And so if you had somewhere that was facing drought, maybe we change diets from rice to millet, or we change crops. And so not only is there a temporal, but, during the course of this conference, I've been thinking of even more refined about how we can tweak little uses instead of abandoning something completely. And that's why I think the managed retreat policy has to become much more sophisticated. It'll allow, actually, I think, a much smoother transition if it's more sophisticated, because, someone doesn't have to totally abandon their farmland. They can say, okay, I'll switch to these 3 crops, or I'll get a subsidy for, one growing season, but I'll still make 2 other growing seasons per year. And if more things were structured around that, then we could actually perhaps keep people in their homes or in their land where it makes sense in a more thoughtful way.
Yeah, immediately made me think about migrant labor and the mobility and migrant labor here and farm labor here in the United States. But it would blow your mind how much work has been done on rice agriculture and adaptation, particularly in Southeast Asia, in these very terms. There's just so much very interesting work there, and I think sometimes that often it's in livelihoods, it's in public health, it's in kind of different dimensions that aren't as oriented as much to the material and the built environment connections that we have. Robert, I wanted to go to you, and I was just so struck by your work, but also the imagery that you provided for us. And the 2 things, the well, one fundamental thing that I sort of took away from this is this idea of durability and some of the trade-offs between resilience and adaptation, right? And some of the maladaptive implications of resilience or in situ engineering resilience, or disaster resilience, as it may be referenced in this context. And I wonder, you showed us in Bangladesh, where you went back to Bangladesh and we had these homes that were slightly elevated. And I wonder to what extent that was, responsive of current conditions. To what extent did that impose additional costs that may have constrained that population by some measure, or prevented some further intra-local mobility ultimately? And then I'm thinking about, and I think it was in Malé, in the capital, the Maldives, where, just unbelievable what they're doing there in terms of land expansion. And I wonder to what extent are we making or having trade-offs from one risk to another, and are we thinking about this more concretely? And maybe that's not a great lead for you, but to what extent of what we see in the Maldives, substituting one risk and one time horizon for another, but not really substantively getting to some of the existential propositions that they face in terms of long-term sea level rise. Are you there, Robert?
Looks like it might be frozen.
Oh, we might have lost you. Well, listen, that was a terrible question on my part. It was it probably would have been a much better response, a more formal response. But I think for those of you who are watching and listening, it's worth going back, if you could, to watch this video later and see some of Robert's work in photography.
Oh, I think
Robert, are you there with us now? You're on mute, Robert. No audio from Robert yet. While Robert's working on that, let's turn over to Isaac for a second. And Isaac, you set up a very interesting research methodology for us, and you sort of drop us off a cliff, which is perfectly fine. This is how research works. Let's hope research is going to fail many more times than it'll ever succeed in these regards. But I wonder if there is something inherent in constraint. Right? If you really find nothing of statistical validity in your findings, but there's a kind of qualitative interpretation that may suggest that indeed, whether it's markets not offering insurance or fire insurance, if it's local counties restraining new development that would account for the growth in the population development, population cohorts, as you broke it down. Is this possibly an idea that we've reached a certain crescendo, or is the new production and housing so limited as a function of supply relative to population growth, we wouldn't see this? We're just shifting the decks on the card. What do you take away from your findings in more qualitative terms?
Well, something I did not consider when I set to do the research is that much of the new construction in the Bay Area mega region, so that's beyond the 9-county area, that's just like a 12-county area that includes places in the Central Valley that a lot of people from the Bay Area are now moving in. A lot of those people in new homes are being built in actually flat plains in Central Valley, which are not fire prone by any chance. This was done right during the onset of the COVID pandemic. So we had no, long-term data about moves during the COVID pandemic at that time. But, as far as we know for qualitative is we don't think that the housing crisis is really forcing people into the WUI. We do know that it's definitely constrained development within the Bay Area itself. And I think a lot of localities within the outlying regions have varying degrees of fire vulnerability. So, some areas are very fire vulnerable and they're building housing. Some other areas are not fire vulnerable at all and they're building lots of housing. And I do think, however, that, this does have qualitative significance that, before we leap to conclusions, we should definitely look into what's actually happening, what's moving on the ground. and that maybe we can stop this from becoming something. And another thing is, we may not know, but now with the COVID pandemic, a lot more people are remote commuting. And as Alice mentioned, there's definitely a whole group of people who moved from the Bay Area to Chico, and Chico's pretty close to a lot of fire-prone areas. You know, is there a possibility that the COVID pandemic, a lot of people moving to more nature-esque areas from the Bay Area, is that causing increase in fire vulnerability? I mean, either for the entirety of California or for the US as a whole? I think that's a really interesting question that needs to be answered, because I'm hearing about people moving to the western slopes of Colorado, you know, people moving to like forests of Oregon from the Bay Area and remote commuting. And I think that would be a really interesting research avenue to go on now concerning current times.
Yeah, that's a great set of questions for future scholarly inquiry. I tend to think it's a little bit overstated in terms of the remote capacity relative to total population, relative to growth, service economy. But you know, with an aging society, retirees, and in a broader trajectory, places like Idaho and the western frontier, there's some real critical questions there, as well as in the Sun Belt, the extent to which we've reached a kind of unsustainable threshold for growth writ large in more rural and ex-urban areas. And certainly it's the ex-urban areas that are growing the most. And even if you have a few people move to a very small town, it can have huge implications on the environment and culture and society in more localized terms anyway. But listen, great conversation. Robert, we're sorry to have missed you, but we hope everything's okay there with the storm. We understand it. We've run out of time, but I want to thank all of our speakers and panelists today for joining us. And I hope that this will be a great resource on video for us to follow up in the future. But thank you all for taking the time to join us and for your insightful work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Jesse.
you.
Take care,
Bye.
everybody.
All right. Bye-bye. Nice
Ciao.
to meet you.